Hey everybody, this video is about viruses. So in this video we're going to talk about the structure of a virus, the size of a virus, whether viruses are living or non-living, how they reproduce, the different ways that they reproduce, and vaccines and how vaccines work. So viruses are, first of all, they're very small. Let's say that this is your cell, this is a healthy human cell. A bacterial cell would be maybe that big, give or take. So that's a bacterial cell. And a virus would be very small, just a little speck like that. That's the virus. So there are these incredibly small things that are actually very simple. If we were to zoom in on the structure of a virus, this is my little zoom in bubble, okay? If we were to zoom in, this is what it would look like. It would basically just be a stringy piece of genetic material that could be either DNA or RNA. There are DNA viruses and there are RNA viruses, just depending on which one of the two they have in the middle. And around that DNA or RNA, they'll never have both, they'll always have one or the other. But around the DNA or the RNA is this bubble that's actually a protein coat. It's made entirely of proteins. Well, not entirely, but that's the main part that makes it up is proteins, okay? Which remember is one of the 4 biomolecules, carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA. And this protein coat is called a capsid. Not a capsule, like what's in bacteria, but a capsid, okay? So DNA or RNA, capsid. That's pretty much it. Now, in addition to that though, viruses do have these things on their surface. These little spiky things that are also proteins that are a part of the capsid. And these little spiky things are called antigens. So every virus has its own unique antigen. So this virus will have a different antigen from a different type of virus, which is different from another kind of virus. Okay, so every virus has its own unique set of antigens. And those antigens act as an identifier. So your body can actually tell the difference between one virus and another based on the antigens that are on the surface of the virus. So I can tell whether this is just the common cold virus, the rhinovirus is what it's called, or if this is the coronavirus. You can tell the difference between those two and react accordingly based on what your body needs to do in order to defeat that specific virus. Okay, that's part of your natural immune response that we're not going to get into the details of. I'm just telling you that your immune system can recognize the difference between the antigens on this virus and the antigens on another virus. And because some viruses need to be defeated in one way and other ones need to be defeated in another way, your body can tell the difference between the two and it can know how it needs to react accordingly to be able to defeat that specific virus. Okay, so that's the shape, structure, and size of viruses. So now that we know a little bit about that, we're going to ask the question, well, are they living? Well, remember that in order to be considered a living thing, something has to satisfy all 7 requirements of what we call Mrs. Green. M-R-S-G-R-E-N. Okay, it's green with 1 E. Each of these letters stands for something. M stands for movement. Something has to be able to move to be considered alive. R is respiration. It has to be able to perform respiration, not just breathing, but breaking down food, like in cellular respiration, what we talked about in the last lesson. Cellular respiration, breaking that down for food and getting energy out of that food, that's respiration, not just breathing. So it has to be able to do that. It has to be able to sense its environment. It has to be able to grow. It has to be able to reproduce. It has to be able to excrete waste. And it has to be able to take in nutrients. Now, viruses really don't do any of these things. They can kind of sense their environment, but it's not like bacteria and human cells. They can't really grow. They can reproduce. That's pretty much all they can do out of all of these things. But they can't even do that on their own. They can't even reproduce on their own because viruses, the way that they reproduce is by tricking a healthy cell into making more copies of the virus for the virus. So the virus can't make its own copies. So let's say you have a human cell, and inside the human cell there's a nucleus, and inside that nucleus is DNA. So the virus will come along. I'm going to make the virus red so you can tell the difference. The virus will come along, and it will attach to the surface of the cell, and it will shoot in a little strand of DNA, virus DNA, okay? And that virus DNA will make its way into the nucleus. And if you'll remember from a previous lesson, what happens in the nucleus, well, what starts off in the nucleus is the process of protein synthesis. If you don't remember that, you need to go back and watch the video on protein synthesis. And in protein synthesis, what happens is that DNA has the instructions for how to make proteins in your body. And what happens when the virus DNA goes in is that your body ends up reading the virus DNA, thinking that it's human DNA, and making virus proteins, which then, of course, assemble together to make new baby viruses that then make you sick. So you would think that your cell would be advanced enough to be able to tell the difference between virus DNA and human DNA, but it can't, because DNA is DNA. It's made up of the same stuff. So if I had DNA in one hand and DNA in another, and one was a virus and one was healthy human DNA, you would not be able to tell the difference, and your body can't tell the difference either. So when this virus DNA gets into the cell, in the nucleus of the cell, your body does protein synthesis just like it always does, but instead of making human proteins, it's making virus proteins. Not knowing or not realizing what it's actually doing, until it's too late, of course. So what happens is that, instead of making healthy human proteins, your body unknowingly is making a whole bunch of virus proteins. And these virus proteins assemble together to make baby viruses, which then explode out of the cell to go and infect other cells and do the same thing all over again. So this is actually just one of the ways that viruses can reproduce. And this is called the Lytic cycle. That's one way viruses do it, but then there's another way called the lysogenic cycle. word lyse means to split or to cut. So the lysogenic cycle is, well, I'll just tell you. I'll show you with a picture. Okay, so there's a healthy cell, and we have a virus that comes along. Oops. Healthy cell DNA. And then we have a virus that comes along, and the virus injects its DNA, its little squiggly DNA, and it actually becomes incorporated into your DNA. But it hides out there. It doesn't really make a lot of noise, it doesn't cause a scene, it doesn't draw a lot of attention. It just hides out in your DNA and pretends like it's just part of your DNA. But what ends up happening is that your cell goes about its business, doing what it does, and the way that your cells reproduce, because they need to reproduce to be able to keep on loading, they don't last forever, they have to make more copies of themselves, and those copies make copies, right? So when this old cell makes copies of itself, and those daughter cells will eventually, these are called daughter cells, by the way, these daughter cells will then split to make daughter cells of their own, and so on and so on. But the problem is, though, that the original cell was infected with virus DNA, which means that its daughter cells are also infected with virus DNA. And their daughter cells are also infected with virus DNA. And so this keeps happening over and over and over and over again, and till you get, a whole bunch of cells in your body that are infected with virus DNA, and your cells still are unaware of what's going on. They still don't know. So it's kind of like a spy who's deep undercover, and they're just waiting. And then they get the signal to activate. And they all activate at once and start making baby virus proteins and baby viruses all at once, and it just overwhelms your body with all these deep undercover guys who have just been waiting for the right moment. And so that's called the lysogenic cycle. It's slower, it doesn't happen as fast, so you could have, weeks could go by after you're infected, and then after 2 or 3 weeks of you actually getting infected, then you start showing symptoms. So if you have a virus like that, like the coronavirus, it takes 2 weeks, could be more or less, to start showing symptoms. So it's because the virus is just lying in wait. But with a lytic cycle, it's much faster. You could start showing symptoms and really getting sick, within a day or two of getting that. And so that's something more like the cold or the flu. It hits you, and you start feeling it right away. So remember, lytic and lysogenic cycle, the two ways that viruses reproduce. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is vaccines and how they work. So the idea behind a vaccine is to, once again, healthy human cell, is to expose your body to a weakened version of the virus. Now, remember, the virus has these antigens on it. So what's the idea behind this is that we're going to expose your body to the antigens so that your cell can see the virus, read the antigens, get to know the virus, and kind of have a practice run at killing the virus before the real thing comes around. Because this is not the real thing, it's just something that's a watered down version of the real thing. It's kind of like just giving the body some practice time so that when the real thing does come along later, it's not being blindsided. It will remember how it beat the virus, or how it beat the virus that had that antigen the first time, so that the second time around, it'll just happen that much quicker and be that much more prepared. So it's not 100% effective, it's not a guarantee, but it does train your body how to respond when the real thing does come along, so that it will reduce your chances of getting seriously sick when the real thing comes along later. But the problem is, though, with viruses, is that they mutate. Not all viruses mutate. Some they all mutate. What I'm trying to say is that they don't all mutate as often as others. Okay, some mutate all the time, some don't mutate very often, but they all mutate. Okay, and what a mutation is a change in the DNA. And when there's a change in the DNA, you may have an entirely different antigen as well. So remember, these antigens on the surface, they can also be different. So if this virus mutates, maybe the antigens are different, maybe the DNA that's inside the virus is different and produces different symptoms. But the point is that your body may not even recognize that same virus after it's mutated. So it has no idea how to defeat that virus. So you can get a vaccine for a virus with these antigens, and then it mutates and the antigens are different, and then you see the same virus later on, only this time the antigens are different. And even though it's the same virus, your body may not have any idea on how to fight it. So it just makes you say, yeah, so what they have to do is they have to keep coming up with new vaccines to adapt to the new mutated virus that you're now seeing. So that's why every year you have like a different flu vaccine for that year, because the flu mutates rapidly, very often. So almost every single year, maybe even multiple times a year, they have to come out with an entirely new vaccine to try to defeat that new mutated version of the flu. And so that is it. I never know how to end these videos, so I'm just going to walk away.